appreciate you coming. For those of you, I'm going to give a little plug to our website. For those of you who haven't been on the British Democrats website, I really recommend it. It's really, really good. Better than GB News. You actually get some truth on there, and I've been lucky enough to have a couple of articles published on it. So if you've not been on it, I do recommend it. Now, Lawrence said, I'm Cliff LeMay. Slight departure from what we normally talk about. I'm here to talk about anthropology. Human, physical anthropology, as opposed to social anthropology, which is hijacked by the left. So there's two things I want to mention. The first one is, who are we? Me and you. Not kings and queens and politicians and famous people, but me and you. Who are we? How did we get here? And how long have we been here? For the second part of my talk, I want to tell you why that's vitally important going forward, why it matters. Now, before I start, I do need to say that although, yes, I'm a fully paid up member of the British Democratic Party, I'm not here today in an official matter, unfortunately, because the new hate speech laws mean that any one of us, me, you, any one of us can be arrested at the drop of a hat just for having a view that runs contrary to the left-wing ideology. You can be arrested for having an opinion in this country today. You don't even have to state it. Someone else can say, see him, I know him, I know what he thinks, and you can be arrested and pulled in front of the courts for having an opinion. That's how totalitarian left-wing ideology has become in this country. So, therefore, I have to state for the record, all views expressed are my own, not official party views. At the end of our discussion, well, my discussion, there will be question and answers, hopefully, time allowing. If not, you can always talk to me afterwards, and I'll be obviously very happy to answer any questions you might have. So for the first part, who are we? Who are the native British people? I'm going to answer that in two ways. Firstly, from the perspective of physical anthropologists, this is the view that physical anthropologists and pathologists held right from the time of Darwin up to the invention or the discovery of DNA. How they thought, who they thought we were. And then secondly, from the new study of ethnogenetics, that is using what DNA evidence informs us of who we are. Before modern scientists had the tool of DNA to show us how people around the world are related to each other, physical anthropologists had to rely on morphology. That is morphological differences, that is differences in anatomy between the various peoples both alive today and those that lived in the past. I'll give you an example. If a physical anthropologist or a modern day pathologist were to be presented with 4 skeletons, no flesh, no internal organs, just the skeletons, one African, one Oriental, one European, one Asian, they would be able to tell you with a very high degree of accuracy, this one is definitely African, this one is definitely Oriental, but the remaining 2 gets a bit complicated. They wouldn't be able to tell you certainly whether they're both Asian, both European, or one of each. Now, the reason for that is modern Europeans and modern Asians share a common root ancestor. But coming back to us, coming back to Europeans, pre-DNA anthropologists divided the native peoples of Europe into 6 to 8 groups. 6 groups in Europe and 2 groups in India, as I say, are relatives, our cousins, people that were most closely related to us more than Oriental people or African people. So if I can ask you to imagine, I haven't got a great big map, if I can ask you to imagine a map of Europe here, Britain here, well, how about that? Britain here, and then obviously Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and coming down Spain, like that. The physical anthropologists, their worldview was that in the very north, if we start in the north and come down in a south-easterly direction, they had us as Lapids. You heard of Lapland, people, they're a distinct group. Nordids, Mediterraneans, Alpinids, Slavids, Armenids, and then our close kin in India, the Nordindids and the Vedids. All were agreed that the native people of Great Britain were a blend of two of those strains. That is, the Mediterraneans and the Nordids. Now, I want you to remember that because that's shortly we're going to see how that compares with the DNA findings, because this is what they felt before DNA. So, hands up, please, those, if you'll indulge me, those of you who were taught about the out of Africa theory at school. Yeah, I mean, only three. I thought it would be everyone. It's not that surprising because that was...
They weren't talking about that when I went to school. It was a long time ago.
Well, I was going to come to that, but that was the prevailing theory at the time, and it is still to this day the one that the mass media and those on the left of academia support, not because it's true, but because it suits their ideology to do so. Many, many years have passed since many of us were at school, and new fossil finds are being discovered all the time. So today there are actually three competing hypotheses. As well as the out of Africa, we now have the multi-regional hypothesis and the out of Eurasia hypothesis, which is the one that I support, because over the last 20 years or so, each new fossil find points more and more to out of Africa as being the least credible of the three, and the multi-regional theory hypothesis, the out of Eurasia hypothesis as being the most credible of the three, with the multi-regional hypothesis being a sort of compromise between the other two. It's a liberal compromise. Now, upright, that is bipedal walking apes, we're told, first appeared in Africa. It's not true. It's not true. The earliest evidence of bipedal apes in Africa is 7 million years old. But we have footprints of bipedal apes from all over southern Europe going back over 8 million years. This would suggest that apes evolved to walk upright in Europe and spread from there into Africa and beyond into Asia. But coming back again to Britain, what is the first evidence that we find, so far for early humans in Britain? And for that, we have to go back almost 1 million years, 950,000 years ago, to a place called Happisburgh in Norfolk. And just slightly later than that, to a place called Pakefield in Suffolk, at 700,000 years old. No fossils yet, but stone tools in Norfolk and footprints left in the soft earth in Suffolk. What was Britain like at that time? Ireland was still attached to Britain, and Britain was still attached to mainland Europe. The climate, well, we know that the last ice age really started in earnest around 480,000 years ago, so just before 500,000 years ago. But between Happisburgh, at almost 1 million years ago, and the beginning of the Ice Age, at 480,000 years ago, almost 500,000 years ago, for reasons that we don't properly understand, the Northern Hemisphere went through periods where the climate fluctuated dramatically between wet and warm, certainly much warmer than today, and cold and dry, much like modern-day Siberia. Both elephant and hippo bones from the warmer times have been found in the mud of the River Thames. And the left-wing One World liberals, they love this evidence, and they seek to convince us that because it was hot, early Britons must have been dark-skinned, and therefore, by extension, African. We're all Africans. They love it. They can't get enough of it. This is, of course, a fantasy. It's a liberal fantasy. It's just as hot in India today and further east in Malaysia as it is in Africa. But modern Indians and modern Malaysians are not African. I would here refer you back to what I was saying about India's Nord-Indic and Vedid populations. Yes, their skin is dark, they live in a hot country, but their morphology is much more closely related to us Europeans and is only very distantly related to modern Africans. Now, modern Asian Indians and modern Africans do share a small amount of DNA, but this is only because Asians, we know, migrated into East Africa 70,000 years ago, mixing there with the indigenous Africans to produce the blend between Asian and African features that are so obvious in today's Ethiopians, Somalis, Eritreans, Sudanese. You can see they're a mixture of African and Indian. It's accepted that during these early climate fluctuations, it happened at least 4 times. It went dramatically within a few thousand years, from very, very hot to very, very cold. The peoples of Europe were forced each time to move south, every time it got cold, into both southern Europe and North Africa, only venturing back north again as and when the climate allowed. So when did we see the first real fossil evidence of humans in Britain? Well, guess what? It's right here in Kent, in Swanscombe, with Swanscombe Man, and in Sussex with Boxgrove Man, both dated to around 500,000 years ago. Swanscombe Man was found 100 years ago, very famous, but they now think actually Swanscombe Man may actually be Swanscombe Woman, and consists of 3 pieces of a skull. But it's quite a gracile skull, so they tend to think it's a female, not a male skull. With Boxgrove, we have 3 separate bones, 3 separate fossils from 3 separate individuals, consisting of a tibia, that's a leg bone, and 2 teeth. It isn't much, but it is proof. And I'm sure that as the years roll by, many more fossils will come to light. Now, as I've said, 500,000 years ago, the Northern Hemisphere suffered a climate catastrophe. They go on about climate change today. This is just as sudden as what they're saying we're going to have heating. This was the Ice Age. It came on very, very quickly. Some scientists say it took 10, 15,000 years. Other scientists say it was almost overnight. It was almost within 1,000 years. So starting just under 500,000 years ago, once again, and it happened at least 4 times, once again, many humans were forced to migrate south, following the fauna and the flora that they were familiar with. Once again, this influx was into the southern Mediterranean and North Africa, stretching eastwards as far as India and even on to China. The morphology of the Chinese is a completely different subject for a different meeting because it's very, very complicated, so I won't go there, I'll stick to Europeans. But this time there was a difference. European man, or Heidelbergensis, as we now call him, had come a very long way. He now had better weapons to hunt with, better clothing to guard against the cold, and more crucially, he'd harnessed fire. With these new advantages, small pockets of Heidelbergensis in northern Europe managed to stay, they managed to cling on in sheltered places like woodland valleys. Now, we know that evolution is driven by adaptation, that is change. So as the climate changed in the north, the early Heidelbergensis that were managed to cling on, they were forced to adapt, they were forced to change with it. So slowly, over hundreds of thousands of years, 400,000 years, those living in the northern regions began to separate from their kin who had migrated south and east, and they became cold adapted. That is, they became the Neanderthals. So now we had 2 kinds of human. We had the Neanderthals right across the north and early modern man right across the south. Now, the Ice Age wasn't officially over until about 12,000 years ago, but warming started occurring in waves from about 60,000 years ago. Southern man, that is our ancestors, those that had moved down to Spain, Italy, Greece, they started once again their long trek north. Along the way, they met with and mated with their Neanderthal cousins, eventually absorbing them as they went, until today all Europeans possess around about 2% Neanderthal DNA. If you send off your DNA for a DNA test, it should come back that you've got at least 2% Neanderthal DNA. Some people have as much as 8%, but that's very rare. Most people around 2%. So that concludes the physical evidence. What anthropologists and pathologists thought happened before we had the DNA evidence to back it up. So now let's examine the DNA evidence to see if it agrees that modern Britons are a blend of 2 distinct types of European. Now, the study of DNA tells us that different global populations have different clusters or groups of DNA that, while being related to other groups, show up more strongly in certain geographical locations around the world. In other words, people who share those haplogroups, as they're known, are more closely related to each other than they are to others. Using this information, scientists realised they could unpick back through time and unravel the origins of these different groups and work out how they spread around the globe. It turns out that those clever old professors of anthropology were right. Modern Britons today do indeed comprise a blend of 2 distinct haplotypes. The DNA evidence shows that there were several isolated groups of early Europeans spread out, as I've said before, from Spain in the west to as far as India in the east. Now, among these groups, 2 stood out numerically from the rest. Group 1 was in Spain, mostly, but had spread out along much of the Mediterranean coast. We know from analysis of their bones and their teeth that marine organisms made up most of their diet. So I'm going to give them a label. I'm going to call these people the fishers. The other main group had been bottled up in the Balkans, and they were now expanding. Now the ice had gone, they were expanding outwards from the Balkans in a northwesterly direction into Western Europe. They were the red meat eaters, the big game hunters. So we call them the hunters. Group 1, the fishers, continued spreading around the Mediterranean, but also spread north along the Atlantic coast, exploiting not only the sea, but coastal rivers and estuaries as they went. These fishers were the first group of us, modern humans, Western humans, to repopulate what would later on become the British Isles. The hunters, meanwhile, were still travelling into Western Europe, populating the forest and plains as they went. And this group, very shortly afterwards, also made it into what would be later become Britain. Physically, these 2 groups, though both European, they looked slightly different. The fishers tended to be shorter and stockier, a bit like modern rugby players. They had a heavier build, they were short and chunky. We know that they had almost exclusively black hair, and this is strange, but blue eyes were very prevalent amongst them. While the hunters were taller, more athletic build, much more like modern footballers, and tended to be blonde, brown or red-haired. Today, 80% of British people are indeed a blend of these 2 types, hunters and fishers, and their haplogroups prove it. Our DNA in these islands, that means, can be traced back 45,000 years. Now that concludes the first part of this discussion, the who are we. So now for the second part. Why does it matter? Why is it important? Because Under international law, indigenous people, which I've just proved we are, have rights. Let me read you just some of those rights. According to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Section 8, 1. Indigenous peoples, us, have the right not to be subject to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. 2. States shall provide effective mechanisms for prevention of and redress for A. Any action which has the aim or effect of depriving them of their integrity as distinct peoples or of their cultural values or ethnic identities. Whenever I read that A, I always think of the Lord Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, refusing to put up any money for us to celebrate St George's Day. He's quite happy for St Patrick's Day, he's quite happy for Diwali and Eid and any other festival, but he refuses to support our culture. That's it. Anyway, B, any action which has the aim or effect of dispossessing them of their lands, territories or resources. I'm going to refer you here to white flight. For those that haven't heard the term, it's a term that estate agents use, where anyone who can afford to get out of London tries to move to an area where there are people similar to themselves, instead of living in a multiracial experiment that has been foisted on us by the left. C, any form of forced population transfer which has the aim or effect of violating or undermining any of their rights. Think about Bradford for a minute. Forced population transfer. Isn't that what's happening in Bradford and Leicester? D, again, any form of forced assimilation or integration. And E, and this is where the media comes in this country, any form of propaganda designed to promote or incite discrimination against the ethnic peoples, against us. You've only got to put on your television and look at any advert that comes up. 9 out of 10 adverts on telly are either demeaning the European population, us, the indigenous people, or they're pushing this diversity madness. By far, the most important tool of democracy, and this is the reason why I'm a member of the British Democratic Party, is popular referenda. Like we had with Brexit, you ask the people. It's the fairest way to gauge what the voters want, the fairest way to gauge public opinion. You don't ask them to vote Labour, Tory, Lib Dem, whoever. You ask them on the subject. What do you think about the health service? What do you think about immigration? You do it subject by subject, not party by party. That's the reason I'm in the British Democrats, because as far as I know, they're one of the very few parties that advocate for popular referenda. We, the British people, were never given a chance to vote on mass immigration into our ancestral homelands. We weren't asked. We were told they're coming. If Labour was needed, which was the excuse we were told after the Second World War, foreign workers could easily have been issued with work visas. Instead, the government of the day decided that they would grant these immigrants British passports. They didn't care that these people had a higher average birth rate. They didn't care that these people had completely different moral, cultural standards, and many of them vastly different religious beliefs. We're in a situation today whereby native British people are already a minority in both Leicester and Bradford. And here, London, our own capital city, the majority of those under 25 years of age have at least one parent who was born abroad. And thanks to Mike, I've got a new statistic that's just come out. In London today, indigenous Europeans, that is British people make up only 35% of Londoners. That makes them the largest demographic group, but when you add those other smaller groups together, we're outnumbered. It is estimated that Britons will be a minority in their own indigenous homeland within 30 years. Unless, that is, we stand up. We stand up for our rights that should be granted to us as an indigenous folk. And there's a problem. In April 2009, over 120 members of Parliament at Westminster signed a declaration which affirmed into law that there was no such thing as an indigenous people in Britain. Not the Scots, not the Welsh, not the Ulstermen, not the Irish, not the English. None of us are indigenous, according to them. Why did they do that? I'm going to be kind here. I've got other suspicions, but let's be kind. DNA evidence was still in its infancy, and to give these MPs the benefit of the doubt, perhaps they believed the now outdated narrative that Britain was a race of immigrants. Yes, the Romans came, but they didn't bring their wives with them. Everyone else, the Celts, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, the Vikings, the Normans, they were us. They were the same people as us. It was just more of us. So we have to challenge this. We must. It's imperative. The onus falls on us. We must make it our duty to go to court to prove legally, and the proof is out there now, it wasn't then, but it is now, that we are indeed an indigenous folk. Only then can we access those rights of indigenous people. Only then can we save our children and our grandchildren from extinction. Because, believe me, in 100 years' time, there will still be African people in Africa. There will still be Oriental people in the Far East. There will still be Indians in India. But white people, that is, European natives, will be almost completely extinct. And that's not an exaggeration. That is based on mathematical evidence. That is what is happening. Not just here, it's happening in France, it's happening in Italy, all over Europe it's happening. We will be extinct in just over 100 years. That is why it matters. So, on that note, I want to thank you for your indulgence, and I'm happy to answer questions, even though my hearing aids run out, so you're going to have to shout at me. If anyone has any questions, I can, if time allowing, I can either answer now or afterwards. Time allowing?